Good morning, everyone. We are going to be going over Chapter 3, Drug Use and the Law. Just a friendly reminder, you will need to watch the lecture videos as well as read or at the very least skim the chapters in order to have the information necessary for the quizzes. So please keep that in mind. So something that I'd like to start off with is that hard drugs. So we're talking about heroin, cocaine, even alcohol really, have not always been illicit or bad. Not that alcohol is illicit, but as we've discussed before, alcohol has some of the most severe impacts on the body than any other substances. Okay. But many of the drugs that are criminalized today have been used for medicinal purposes in the past. The information that we have on substances is constantly evolving, especially from the time that we're going to look at here in a second. And it is a major reason why the scheduling of substances needs to be considered with the research that's coming out. So for example, and we're going to dive into this a little bit deeper later, Schedule 1 substances, so substances that are considered illicit and have no medicinal purposes. One of those substances is marijuana. And what we know now is that there are medicinal purposes for marijuana. Psilocybin is also considered a Schedule 1 drug, and I don't know if you know this, but we are starting to use psilocybin in mental health treatment as well as end-of-life treatment. We'll look at that throughout the class too. So the consideration of how drugs are scheduled, criminal reform, and alternative ways of treatment for substance users needs to be considered periodically throughout time, moving again with the research that's coming out. So this ad is from 1885 when we were using cocaine as toothache drops, right? If you've ever used cocaine, you know that it has a numbing effect, okay? Also, asthma cigarettes, so cigarettes that you would smoke for temporary relief of asthma. Also says that it effectively treats allergies, foul breath, diseases of the throat. If you're a smoker, you likely know that this is not the case. Cigarettes are not going to help with asthma. Oh, and fun fact, don't give it to your kids under 6. If you see here on the bottom, not recommended for children under 6, but over 6 is okay. This is an over-the-counter pain reliever that had heroin in it. Okay, so this came out in 1901. Heroin hydrochloride. Okay, you can order a supply right from your pharmacy. See these children sharing a bottle on the bottom. And this is a liquid version or powdered version of cannabis. Keep in mind it's mixed with alcohol. It is labeled as poison. Also uses sedative and pain reliever. So as you know, if we look back over these photos, this is certainly not the case. And prior to 1906, manufacturers, sellers of these drugs had no legal responsibility, okay? So in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was enacted. And really, this is a great setup for what we would later call the FDA, which we'll talk about. But really, in 1906, all it did was require truth in labeling. So it indicated the amounts of potentially dangerous ingredients like cocaine, heroin, alcohol, morphine, but it did not label it as addictive or habit forming or have any kind of indications that way. There was an amendment made 6 years later that held manufacturers responsible for any fraudulent claims. So say they said that there was therapeutic effects or curative effects we could cure cancer, for instance, with this morphine, unless they could prove it, and that was the thing. What proof looked like wasn't properly defined. So really, this amendment didn't help much. Okay, because fraud continued to be hard to prove. And it didn't really improve products, it just forced pharma companies to be more vague and more creative with their language when it came to marketing and advertisements. In 1938, the Food and Drug Act turned to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and how this came about was case went to the Supreme Court where an antibiotic drug was mixed with an antifreeze-like substance, and it killed over 100 people, many of them being children. So this was a sulfa drug, so a pretty common antibiotic that we even use today, that was mixed with, I forget the exact chemical compound, but it's very similar to antifreeze. After this amendment or act was released, companies had to apply and prove drugs as safe. They didn't have to prove them as effective, they just had to prove that it wouldn't kill you. Okay, so keep in mind, we're still not looking at the potential long-term or even short-term effects, we're just making sure that it's not going to kill people. And they primarily started doing this through animal testing. Drug labels had to start including how to use them safely. Okay. It also classified certain drugs that could no longer be purchased over the counter and had to be prescribed by a doctor. Okay. There was another amendment made in 1951 that said all new drugs were to be by prescription until data was collected deeming it safe. Okay. So basically what that looked like is animal testing and then humans being prescribed the drug by a doctor, and then the data would be collected from those folks, and if they didn't die or weren't severely harmed, it could be released to an over-the-counter substance. So eventually, the FDA came out with, well, let me just go back for a second. So many of the laws around food and drugs and cosmetics are still based on this, okay? Animal testing has gotten a little less, okay, but we still test products on animals. But for the most part, the way that we market and release drugs to the public is still rooted in this idea, okay? Now we have clinical research studies that happen before we release it to the public, which again is a great step forward. We have preclinical studies, clinical studies, and then an FDA review. So typically in preclinical studies, we are testing on rats or mice or animals. Clinical studies, we are testing on humans, voluntary humans. And then it goes, all the data that has been collected goes to the FDA for review. Fun fact that I'd like to share, in these clinical studies, it's very similar. So we're proving safety, and we do have to prove efficacy to some degree. And by efficacy, I mean effectiveness of the substance. However, you could have 100 studies, 98 of which say the drug doesn't work or doesn't work with the primary population, or doesn't work with most folks, let's just say, and 2 could be effective and it could still get passed by the FDA and then go on the market. So with that being said, there are many substances on the market that have not really necessarily proven to be efficient and to work, which is scary. So we're going to talk somewhat about the war on drugs. You're going to get more information from this in the optional resources section of this week's module. There's also a book, a really good book on the war on drugs, which I'll share in a few minutes. But a couple of the highlights of the war on drugs timeline, okay? So we first started with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, excuse me. So this was the first regulation of controlled substances, or we made opium and cocaine controlled substances. And it started to be prohibited. Okay, for a while it could be prescribed by a doctor, but you could no longer purchase it over the counter. And then in the 1920s, we had prohibition, so the banning of use and manufacturing of alcohol with the 18th Amendment. In 1937, we had the Marijuana Tax Act. So marijuana is still legal. Now we just started to tax the sale of cannabis. Okay. We're not going to spend too much time here. We could spend the whole day talking about this and the timeline and all of the variables involved. In 1970s, the Controlled Substances Act was released, calls for the regulation of certain drugs and substances, and this is when the scheduling that we talked about earlier begins. And again, we're going to look closer at that in a minute. So the actual war on drugs, if you will, was declared by Richard Nixon in 1971. There was some speculation that this was kind of a buzzword or a buzz topic to keep Nixon in office. From what I understand and from what I've read, that makes sense to me. You know, appealing to a certain population in the country so that he could get votes. He also stated enforcement must be coupled with a rational approach to the reclamation of the drug user himself. So, fun fact, Nixon was also a huge advocate for treatment. Okay, so originally the war on drugs, you typically hear about Reagan because that's when the criminalization really began. But when Nixon first started enforcing the war on drug agenda, there was a lot of focus on rehabilitation. And lots of money was actually placed towards treatment, education, and prevention rather than law enforcement and interdiction. Okay. Demand reduction focused on treatment and prevention, whereas supply reduction focuses on law enforcement. So, kind of how the war on drugs kind of balances back and forth is we either want to reduce the demand, which I think is appropriate, right? So we're going to focus on treatment and how to prevent substance use in the first place. And then supply reduction focuses on DEA type activity. So law enforcement, finding cartels, finding manufacturers, finding dealers, which also makes sense. But when you think about who really gets incarcerated for substances, it's typically not the big folks, okay, or the big players, if you will. 73, the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, proposed harsher prison sentences, including what we now know as mandatory minimums for drug trafficking. Okay, so transporting drugs, especially drugs that are packaged or known to be going to sale. And Nixon followed suit. Okay. He outlined a plan to help step up these prison sentences. He was very clear. He stated, quote, "These are very harsh measures to be applied within very rigid guidelines and providing only a minimum of sentencing discretion to judges. But circumstances warrant such provisions." So at this point, Nixon deemed the war on drugs getting so bad that we needed to have these mandatory minimums, essentially to scare folks into not participating in the drug world. and Watergate happened. If you're unfamiliar with Watergate, you can Google it. And kind of the war on drugs, I wouldn't say it fizzled out completely, but it was certainly overshadowed. The Reagan administration picked it back up in the early 80s when the true war on drugs began. True meaning this is when the prison sentences for drugs increased tremendously, especially through those mandatory minimums. And eventually, these mandatory minimum sentencing was, to some degree, even taken out of the judge's hands, right? It's just, if this happened, this is the sentence. More of the funding was taken away from treatment and education and prevention and put towards law enforcement. Okay. Depending on how old you are, you're familiar with the Just Say No campaign, which eventually, different campaign, but eventually it kind of led to the DARE campaign, which many more of us might be familiar with, which was an effort to educate children on the dangers of drug use. The success of that program is a whole other conversation, but she tried. I forget the numbers, the statistics exactly, but incarcerations increased significantly for nonviolent drug crimes during Reagan's administration. And in '86, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established, again, those mandatory minimum prison sentences for certain drug offenses, regardless of history, priors, what the judge thought, any kind of like character reference or having children, nothing was considered. It was just, you did this sentencing. Law was later heavily criticized as having racist ramifications. There is certainly systemic oppression and racism and marginalization interwoven throughout the war on drugs. And if that's something that interests you, again, check out this book that I'm going to show you here in a second. In the 80s, we also saw much longer and much more punitive prison sentences for offenses involving certain drugs rather than the other. So most commonly heard of is crack versus cocaine. Essentially, it's the same thing. One is mixed and cooked, and the other is not, but they are the same substance. But primarily poor, what was thought of as Black folks used crack, and they were criminalized more severely, given much longer prison sentences. Whereas the folks who were thought to be using powder cocaine were mostly white, and so they got less harsh prison sentences. And that's all I'll say about that, but there are certainly a lot of books written on this topic, a lot of blogs you can read online, a lot of articles. So if that's something that interests you, check it out. There is an overwhelming amount of data showing that people of color were targeted and arrested on suspicion of drug use at a much higher rate than whites. We also see folks of color disproportionately being incarcerated. The war on drugs has, support for the war on drugs has decreased tremendously with science and evidence coming out to the contrary, saying that this type of legislation, this type of lens of looking at drug use does not work. Okay, there's still some folks who pretty passionately support the effort and the supply reduction side. It just doesn't work, and we're going to kind of unpack that here in a sec. In 2010, Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced that discrepancy between crack and powder cocaine and other substances. from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. So there is still a discrepancy, an unfair discrepancy, if I may add. However, to improve them. The recent legalization of marijuana in several states has kind of led to this more tolerant political view, or it seems to have led. Of course, there are some folks out there who have not changed their minds, but it seems to be generally more accepted, especially with its medicinal purposes being exposed. We're still fighting the war on drugs, less intensity and less publicity. We don't necessarily call it the war on drugs anymore, but I promise you it is still happening. So some other things to consider when it comes to the war on drugs and the legislation that has been passed during this time. The DEA, the way that they are trying to reduce the supply is effective about 1% of the time. So one of their primary objectives is to stop the flow of drugs into the United States. There's a really good video on this week. And they're just not effective. You can't stop drugs from coming in. As long as there is a demand for it, they're going to keep coming. It is estimated that between 25 and 75% of violence in the U.S. is somehow related to the war on drugs, violence and crime. When you reduce the supply, the substances are still there, the price just goes up, and people are still going to buy them. Okay. Also, production means will always be replaced. There's always a new, more effective way to make a substance or to make a similar substance. Okay. So for example, there was kind of like this nationwide thing where Sudafed was started to be controlled. You have to show your ID to go buy Sudafed, or other chemicals to make meth. They became highly regulated. So the meth producers here went out of business, and lots of small productions started popping up, especially in rural areas. More chemical regulation happened, kind of shut down those smaller scale productions, and then the Mexican cartels took over. Okay, so the supply never reduced, and the drug actually became cheaper and more potent. Okay, so the way that we're trying to reduce supply, it's just not working. So the book that I'm referring to that talks about the war on drugs is called Chasing the Scream by an investigative journalist from the UK named Johan Hari. Please check it out. It might even be a requirement in one of your classes if you're in the A&D program, I'm not sure. Excuse me just a second. So these are the factors that are supposed to be used when determining drug scheduling. So the abuse potential, the scientific evidence, which the way that scheduling is right now, we're looking at scientific evidence from years and years ago that is damn near false at this point. The state of current scientific knowledge is supposed to be considered, but it's typically not. We're also going to look at the pattern of abuse when it comes to scheduling, the psychological and physiological dependency, how long it takes to become dependent on the substance, and whether the substance is an immediate precursor of a substance that's already controlled. So, for instance, if we're looking at marijuana and spice would be, or marijuana would be a precursor to spice, okay? Or morphine would be a precursor to heroin, okay? So Schedule I substances have a high abuse potential, allegedly, and no currently approved medicinal uses. Keep in mind, psilocybin we're in stage 3 clinical trials and using psilocybin for anxiety, depression, addiction, and end-of-life treatment, okay? As well as MDMA, we're using that in folks with treatment-resistant PTSD, also in stage 3 clinical trials, which means we're getting there. Certainly, at the very least in some states, it is going to start being used for those purposes. Marijuana is also a Schedule I drug currently, and in many states it's legal. So, Schedule II substances have high abuse potentials, but are approved for medicinal uses and can be prescribed. So this includes narcotics such as oxycodone, oxycontin, whatever you call it nowadays, morphine and prescription stimulants. Schedule 3 to 5, I'm sorry, that's a typo on my part. Substances reflect the likelihood of abuse but have clinical usefulness, such as codeine, buprenorphine or Suboxone, benzos, steroids, and cough medicine. What I'll tell you right now is while benzos can only be, I mean, there's certainly illicit benzos being created and manufactured, but primarily they're prescribed by a doctor, and they're very, very dangerous. From the research that I've done and from my understanding, they're much more dangerous than anything you're going to see in the Schedule I category. Okay. You actually die from withdrawal, and if you mix them with certain things like alcohol, your breathing can slow to the point of death. So alcohol or narcotics. Okay. So the scheduling is certainly wonky. It needs to be reconsidered, maybe sometime in our lifetime. So some of the questions around drug use in the law are, if a person abuses a drug, should he or she be treated like a criminal or as a sick person inflicted with a disease? Now, I've talked about my view on the disease model of addiction, and especially when this new measure came out in Oregon to decriminalize personal amounts of drugs like meth and heroin, you had a lot of folks in the recovery community come out and say, jail actually saved me. Like my crimes and my drug use being criminalized saved me because it gave me time and space to reflect. And while that may be true for many of us, generally speaking, that is not true. In fact, criminalization and being incarcerated has major implications on mental health, on whether or not, on what your lifestyle looks like once you're released, right? How to get housing, how to get employed, and the likelihood of returning to jail or returning to incarceration is extremely high. Okay. So in my opinion, and based on the research I've done, we shouldn't be criminalizing this. How the user is distinguished from the distributor of illicit drug and who should be more harshly punished. If you really break it down, people who are manufacturing and distributing drugs, they're making money for their family, and you know, we talked about my personal views on the drug user, and I want everybody to kind of think about this and do your own research. You certainly do not have to align with my views. But this is all part of a macro system. We can think about capitalism. We can think about the implications of consumerism, and you know what, I'm not even going to go there. There are so many factors involved in how we make money and the criminalization either way, I think on either end of the spectrum, needs to be reconsidered. And then, are the laws and associated penalties effective deterrents against drug use or abuse? And how is this effectiveness determined? So is criminalizing folks and incarcerating them for nonviolent drug crimes, is this really helpful? I can tell you that most of the folks who are incarcerated for nonviolent drug crimes are not rehabilitated. They're not given treatment. They're just put in jail or prison, okay? And so, again, we're still missing that treatment, education, and prevention piece. And the treatment to address underlying disorders too, right? What we know about addiction is that it's typically not the primary problem. It's a symptom of primary problems, which likely has to do with trauma. Okay. So some of the variables of the drug legalization debate. Excuse me, I'm starting to lose my mind here. So, a lot of advocates are pushing for decriminalization or legalization of substances. And some of the arguments for legalization is that criminalization incarceration doesn't work for most people. It would decrease illegal black market and criminal networks, which may in turn decrease crime and violence in general in our communities. The government could accrue taxation revenue and increase associated industry jobs with cultivating marijuana or psilocybin or whatever. And then against legalization is that it reduces the stigma to some degree. So we have seen in some countries that have decriminalized substances increase substance use in like 15 to 24-year-olds. Now, it doesn't increase the rates of substance use disorders, but it does increase, or we may see an increase in experimentation with drugs. Okay. We would spend more tax dollars and cause increased economic burden like cigarettes and alcohol do. So the economic burden, especially on the medical industry, and our tax money between cigarette and alcohol-related disease and death is a lot. It's a lot. Also, some may consider this immoral or unacceptable. That Chasing the Scream book that we were just referring to does a lot of research on Portugal. So in 2001, Portugal had, I think, 1% of their population was using addicted to IV heroin. They had a pretty substantial drug problem. And they became the first country to decriminalize personal drug possession for all drugs. Okay, so similar to what Oregon's doing now. Keep in mind that decriminalization differs from legalization. It does not protect drug manufacturers, suppliers, or traffickers. It only protects the users with small amounts on them for personal use. It treats substance use as a public health issue rather than a criminal act. Okay. Increases access to treatment. Hepatitis C and HIV rates have dropped between 80 and 90%. It's pretty substantial. And of course, access to clean paraphernalia, such as needles, is also something that has been introduced. Stigma has been reduced. More people may be trying substances, though rates of suds have not increased. As we talked about, it is much more likely that folks are going to go to treatment. They actually have access to that treatment. So the money that we've taken, the money that Portugal has saved on incarcerating folks has actually gone to increasing treatment beds. Some other key terms from the chapter that you're going to want to familiarize yourself with are, again, demand and supply reduction, inoculation, drug courts and their purpose in our communities, drug scheduling, which we talked about, and then the DEA. So the purpose of the DEA, what it stands for, that kind of thing. And here are some extra resources if you'd like to dive deeper into this information. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.